She looked me straight in the eye and said, "I don't owe you anything." Those words echoed in my head like a verdict, cutting deeper than any argument we'd ever had. It was in that moment I realized I had been living as if I owed her everything, bending and breaking myself just to hold our marriage together. But when she said those words, I finally stopped owing her anything at all. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Daniel Reyes, and for most of my adult life I thought marriage meant sacrifice without limits. I believed that if I just gave enough, my time, my energy, my finances, my loyalty, then love would thrive and stability would follow. I built my life around that belief, structuring my days and even my ambitions around what I thought my wife Andrea needed. When I first met her, I was convinced I had found the woman who would walk with me through everything, and I promised myself I would do whatever it took to make her happy. Back then, it didn't feel like giving up anything. It felt like love in its purest form. But the truth is, I was setting myself up to live in a one-sided relationship, where love became less about partnership and more about servitude. Andrea and I met at a mutual friend's birthday dinner in Manila. She had this confidence about her, the kind that made you want to pay attention. While others at the table were trying too hard to impress, she was effortlessly herself, laughing loudly, telling stories about her travels, and asking sharp questions that made people stumble. I was drawn to her immediately, not just because of her beauty, but because she seemed like she had no need to prove herself. I thought that kind of strength would complement me perfectly, and in many ways it did in the beginning. I was quiet and methodical, more grounded, while she was bold and spontaneous. The balance felt right, like we were two halves of a whole. When we first started dating, Andrea would tease me for being too structured. She'd say, "Loosen up, Dan, not everything has to be planned." I'd laugh it off, thinking she was just encouraging me to experience life more freely. In return, she seemed to enjoy the stability I offered. If she wanted to chase a new project, I was there to support her. If she wanted to drop everything and take a weekend trip, I'd rearrange my work schedule without complaint. Her friends often said she was lucky to have someone like me, and I took pride in that. I wore it like a badge of honor, that I was the man who could give endlessly without asking for anything in return. But what I didn't realize at the time was how easily giving can turn into owing, at least in someone else's eyes. Andrea began to treat my sacrifices not as acts of love, but as obligations. When she wanted something, I felt guilty if I couldn't provide it. When she demanded my time, I believed it was my responsibility to drop everything. She never explicitly asked me to diminish myself, but through small comments, dismissive gestures, and subtle criticisms, I learned that keeping her happy required me to give up more and more of who I was. And because I loved her, I complied, convincing myself that this was what commitment looked like. The night she told me, "I don't owe you anything," was not the climax of a single fight, but the culmination of years of imbalance. We were arguing about something as small as me asking her to have dinner with my parents. It was a simple request, one I thought any partner would consider reasonable. But Andrea reacted as if I had asked her to betray herself. Her voice was sharp, her face cold. "I don't owe you anything, Daniel," she said, as if the very suggestion of compromise was an insult. And in that moment, I felt a shift inside me. It wasn't just about the dinner anymore. It was about every late night I stayed up waiting for her. When she didn't come home, every project I passed up because she wanted me at her side, every dream I buried because it didn't align with hers. I suddenly saw the pattern clearly. I had built my life around the idea that I owed her everything, while she believed she owed me nothing. The weight of that realization crushed me, but at the same time, it lit a spark of defiance I hadn't felt in years. I remember lying awake that night, staring at the ceiling, playing her words over and over again in my head. The irony struck me hard. Love, which was supposed to be about partnership, had become a transaction where the scales were permanently tipped against me. I thought back to all the moments I had convinced myself that things would get better, that she would change, that one day she'd see the effort I poured into us. But now I understood. Andrea wasn't going to change. She didn't see my sacrifices as love, only as the bare minimum of what she deserved. That night was the first time in years I considered what it might mean to stop owing her everything. To reclaim parts of myself I had buried so deeply I almost forgot they existed. To remember that marriage is supposed to be a partnership, not a sentence. The road to that realization would not be simple or painless, but in that instant, I knew that something inside me had shifted permanently. Before everything unraveled, my life with Andrea looked picture-perfect from the outside. I worked as a financial analyst for a mid-sized firm in Makati, spending my days buried in spreadsheets and market forecasts, then returning home to the small but modern condominium we shared in Mandaluyong. My routine was steady, almost predictable. Morning gym, long hours at the office, quick dinners with Andrea when she was free, and quiet weekends that alternated between visiting my family in Quezon City or accommodating Andrea's social calendar. If someone had asked me back then what my life was like, I would have said it was stable, secure, and heading in the right direction. That's how I saw myself too, a dependable man who built order and security for the people he loved. I prided myself on being reliable. My father used to say, "A man is measured by how well he carries responsibility," and I carried those words like a creed. I wasn't the loudest in the room or the most charming, but people knew they could count on me. I believed that if I stayed disciplined, worked hard, and took care of my loved ones, everything else would fall into place. Andrea, with her whirlwind energy and big dreams, became the perfect complement to that steady identity. She gave my life a vibrancy it didn't have before, and I, in return, gave her stability. At least that was the exchange I thought we had agreed upon. Andrea's world was different from mine in every way. She worked in advertising, a field that thrived on creativity, spontaneity, and constant reinvention. Her hours were unpredictable, her social life busy, and her ambitions always shifting from one project to the next. While I made plans months in advance, Andrea thrived on last-minute decisions. On Friday evenings, while I was looking forward to a quiet dinner at home, she would call me at 6 p.m. to say she had tickets to a new art exhibit or an invite to a rooftop party. At first, I admired her ability to seize the moment. I thought her spontaneity was what my life needed, a reminder that not everything had to be mapped out, and so I adjusted. I told myself it was good for me to step out of my routines, to be more flexible, to let her world seep into mine. When we first moved in together, the differences between us were even more apparent. Andrea decorated the place with bold colors, statement art pieces, and quirky furniture that clashed with my preference for muted tones and clean lines. I didn't argue. I told myself it was just decoration, and if it made her happy, then it was worth it. The way she filled our home reflected her personality. Loud, vibrant, unpredictable. I convinced myself I liked living in her world because I equated compromise with love. Our friends noticed the contrast between us, often joking about how we were opposites who somehow made it work. At gatherings, Andrea would be the center of attention, animated and full of stories, while I stood at her side, smiling quietly, adding a comment here and there. People said I grounded her, that I was the anchor that kept her from floating too far. I took pride in that role, even though it often meant dimming my own presence so hers could shine brighter. To me, that was the essence of partnership, balancing each other out, even if it meant stepping back. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I also believed in providing for us, in every sense of the word. Financially, I was cautious and responsible. I managed our bills, set up savings accounts, and made sure we never fell behind on rent or expenses. Andrea, meanwhile, had a looser relationship with money. She loved shopping, dining at trendy restaurants, and traveling whenever she had the chance. Early in our relationship, I covered more of the practical expenses without complaint, telling myself it was fair since she was still climbing her career ladder while I was already established. But little by little, it became expected rather than appreciated. When the internet bill was due, Andrea would casually say, "You've got it, right?" as if it was obvious. When she wanted to splurge on a new gadget, she would frame it as something we deserved, though it often came out of my pocket. I didn't argue because I thought providing was part of my role, part of what made me a good husband. Still, there were moments of genuine connection that kept me anchored in those early years. We had late-night talks on the balcony, where Andrea would share her big dreams of starting her own creative agency one day, and I would tell her about my hopes of buying a house for us in the suburbs. She would lean against me, listening intently, her head on my shoulder, and I would think, this is what love is supposed to feel like. Those moments made the sacrifices feel worthwhile, as if everything I gave up was just part of building a shared future. Looking back now, I see how much of myself I buried in the process of building that shared life. I stopped playing basketball with my college friends because Andrea complained I was too tired to go out with her afterward. I passed on a promotion that required longer hours because Andrea insisted she wanted me more present at home. Even the books I used to love collecting started gathering dust because Andrea said they cluttered the space and she preferred clean shelves. At the time, these didn't feel like losses. They felt like small choices made in the name of harmony. But piece by piece, I was erasing myself from my own life, making space for Andrea's world while shrinking my own. To anyone looking from the outside, we seemed like a balanced couple. People admired how supportive I was, how Andrea seemed to flourish with me by her side. But what no one saw was the subtle erosion of my identity, the way I was molding myself entirely around her needs and preferences. I had built my entire normal around being the dependable one, the giver, the stabilizer. And for a while, I thought that was enough. I thought that if I just kept giving, one day the balance would naturally shift back, and Andrea would meet me halfway. I couldn't see then that my idea of partnership was slowly becoming a one-sided contract, one where I was the only one keeping score, and she was living as if she owed me nothing at all. When I look back at how everything started with Andrea, it's easy to see how I fell into the pattern of giving more than I should. In those early days, everything about her felt larger than life. She was the kind of woman who could walk into a crowded cafe and have the barista, the waiter, and half the customers remember her by the time she left. I first saw her at that birthday dinner, but our story really began a week later when she messaged me out of the blue, saying, "You're quieter than most guys I know." I find that intriguing. It wasn't flirtatious in the typical sense. It was sharper, like she was challenging me to explain myself. I was instantly hooked. We started talking every night after that. While I was usually in bed by 10 p.m., I found myself staying up until 2 or 3 in the morning just to hear her stories. She would recount the chaos of her workday, rant about demanding clients, and then pivot to dreams of someday running her own creative firm. I mostly listened, chiming in occasionally with encouragement, and she seemed to thrive on having an audience who gave her undivided attention. For me, it was refreshing. I wasn't used to someone so bold, someone who took up space unapologetically. I thought her confidence was a sign of strength, and I convinced myself that it was the perfect balance to my quieter nature. Our first official date wasn't the typical dinner and a movie setup. Andrea suggested we go hiking in Rizal. I wasn't much of an outdoorsman, but I agreed because the excitement in her voice was contagious. I remember climbing those trails, sweating buckets, while she bounded ahead, pointing out views and insisting on taking photos at every corner. She laughed at my exhaustion, calling me the serious guy who doesn't know how to have fun, and I laughed with her, believing that she was teaching me how to live in the moment. By the time we reached the peak and looked out at the city sprawl below, I was convinced I had found someone who could pull me out of my comfort zone and make my life more vibrant. In the beginning, Andrea had this way of making me feel chosen. She would tell me, "You're different, Daniel. Other guys try too hard, but you just show up." Hearing that from her felt like validation, as though being steady and dependable wasn't just boring but actually special. I wanted to keep being that man for her, the one who grounded her while still letting her soar. So when she made last-minute plans, I rearranged my schedule. When she wanted to go out after a long day at work, I pushed aside my tiredness to accompany her. I told myself this was what it meant to be adaptable, to show her I was committed. The charm of those first months was intoxicating. Andrea showered me with attention when she wanted it, and I mistook that for genuine connection. She'd send me random texts during the day, memes, inside jokes, sometimes just a quick "thinking of you." She would tag me in photos with captions like, "my rock," or "lucky to have this one," and I soaked up every bit of it. It wasn't that I needed public validation, but seeing her so openly affectionate made me believe we were building something strong. Yet even then, there were small moments that should have made me pause. Like the time she borrowed money for a new pair of shoes she had to have, and brushed it off as a small favor, promising to pay me back but never doing so. or the way she would get irritated when I couldn't immediately say yes to one of her spontaneous invitations, acting as if my hesitation meant I didn't care enough. At the time, I rationalized it all. I told myself every couple had little imbalances, and that Andrea's strong personality was just part of her charm. The truth was, I was already learning to silence my own needs in favor of hers, mistaking that silence for love. Our relationship escalated quickly. Within a year, Andrea suggested we move in together, and though I had reservations about the timing, I agreed. I thought living under the same roof would bring us closer, solidify our bond, and help us build toward marriage. What I didn't realize was that it would also accelerate the erosion of boundaries I hadn't even known I needed. Andrea framed it as the next natural step, and I wanted to prove I was serious about her. So I signed the lease with her, rearranged my finances to cover most of the rent, and convinced myself it was all part of investing in our future. I remember one conversation during that first year that, in hindsight, should have been a glaring red flag. We were talking about chores, dividing up who would do what in the condo. I suggested we split tasks evenly since we both worked full-time. Andrea looked at me and said, almost casually, "You're better at organizing stuff, so why don't you just handle most of it? I'll focus on keeping things exciting." She laughed as if it was a joke, but in the months that followed, I realized she wasn't joking at all. I ended up handling bills, groceries, cleaning, and most of the cooking, while she picked out where we'd go on weekends. Back then, I didn't protest. I told myself I was just being the responsible one, and that it was easier this way. The beginning of our relationship was filled with moments that felt magical but were underpinned by patterns I didn't see clearly. I thought her confidence meant she didn't need to prove anything, when in reality it meant she often dismissed the efforts of others, including mine. I thought her spontaneity meant she was full of life, when sometimes it just meant she had little regard for how her choices affected me. But I wasn't looking for flaws then. I was looking for reasons to believe. I wanted Andrea to be the woman I thought she was, the partner who would meet me halfway if I just kept showing her how committed I was. And so, in the beginning, I mistook imbalance for excitement and sacrifice for love. I told myself I was lucky to have her, that the effort I poured in was proof of how much I cared. What I didn't realize was that those small concessions, those quiet sacrifices, were the first threads unraveling a fabric I thought we were weaving together. It all started so promising, so full of possibility, and I had no idea the foundation was already cracked. There was a period in our marriage when, if someone had asked me if I was happy, I would have said yes without hesitation. Those were the good times, the seasons where Andrea and I seemed in sync, when the laughter came easily, and the weight of responsibility didn't yet feel like a burden pressing only on my shoulders. It's important to remember those moments because they explain why I stayed, why I kept believing, and why the eventual unraveling of everything cut so deeply. Without those glimpses of joy, I might have walked away sooner. But with them, I convinced myself that love was real, even if it was fleeting. I remember one particular summer when everything felt perfect. Andrea and I decided to take a week-long trip to Palawan. She had just finished a grueling campaign at her agency, and I had managed to save up vacation days. From the moment we landed, it felt like stepping into a postcard. The beaches glowed with white sand, the water sparkled a shade of blue I had never seen before, and Andrea seemed lighter, freer than she usually was in the city. We spent our days island hopping, snorkeling, and laughing about getting sunburned because neither of us remembered to reapply sunscreen. At night, we'd sit on the balcony of our small beachfront hotel, watching the stars as she leaned against me, her hand intertwined with mine. She said, "This is what I always imagined life could feel like." And in that moment, I believed her. I believed us. Back in Manila, we had routines that, when they worked, felt comforting. We'd cook dinner together on Sundays, Andrea chopping vegetables while I manned the stove, music playing in the background. Sometimes she'd dance around the kitchen, pulling me in despite my awkward steps, and we'd laugh until we nearly burned the food. On Friday nights, when she wasn't out with friends, we'd curl up on the couch, binging series and eating takeout. Those small, ordinary nights meant more to me than grand vacations. They made me feel like we were a team, building a life together in the everyday details. Andrea also had a way of making me feel proud to be with her during those good times. She was charming around my friends, quick with a joke, and generous with compliments about me in front of others. I still remember a dinner we had with my college group. One of them teased me about being the boring one. And Andrea immediately jumped in, saying, "Don't let Daniel fool you. He's the one who keeps me grounded. Without him, I'd probably be lost." The way she said it, with a smile and a squeeze of my hand, made me feel like I mattered. Those words stayed with me long after the dinner ended. In those moments, I could overlook the little imbalances. When she took me out with her friends and I ended up sitting quietly while she dominated the conversation, I told myself it didn't matter because afterward she would turn to me and say, "I'm glad you came. I love when you're with me." When she bought something expensive without consulting me but later surprised me with a small gift, I let it go because I saw it as her way of showing affection. The highs outweighed the lows, or at least that's what I kept telling myself. The happiest season of all came during our wedding planning and the first months of marriage. Andrea threw herself into planning the details, from the venue to the music, and I gave her full rein because I wanted her to have the day she dreamed of. When we stood at the altar, surrounded by family and friends, Andrea looked radiant, and the way she smiled at me made me believe we were truly stepping into forever. I promised in my vows to always stand by her, to provide, to support, and to love her unconditionally. She promised passion, adventure, and loyalty. At that moment, everything felt balanced, and I believed our promises were enough to carry us through anything. The early days of marriage were filled with warmth. Andrea took an unusual interest in our home, spending weekends shopping for decor, cooking experimental meals, and inviting friends over for dinner parties. I loved seeing her so invested in creating a space for us. We'd host gatherings where she played the perfect hostess, and I quietly ensured everything ran smoothly. Our friends often told us how lucky we were to have found each other, and their words reinforced my belief that what we had was rare. Even in intimacy, we had stretches of closeness that made me forget the undercurrents of imbalance. Andrea could be tender and affectionate, pulling me close after long days, whispering that she couldn't imagine her life without me. Those moments felt raw and genuine, like the walls between us dropped, and I got to see the softer side of her that the world rarely did. They became the fuel I carried with me during the harder times, proof that underneath it all, there was love worth holding on to. Looking back now, I understand how intoxicating those good times were. They painted a picture of what I thought we could always be if I just kept trying hard enough. They made me overlook the cracks in the foundation, convincing me that every sacrifice was worth it if it meant holding on to the joy of those fleeting moments. I believed the good outweighed the bad because I was desperate for it to be true. The truth is, the good times were real, but they weren't the whole story. They were like bright, fleeting sunsets, beautiful, captivating, but impossible to hold on to. And because I was so mesmerized by their beauty, I didn't notice the night that always followed. The good times didn't vanish all at once. They faded gradually, replaced by moments that felt slightly off but were easy to ignore if I convinced myself hard enough. The first warning signs weren't explosive fights or dramatic betrayals. They were smaller, quieter details, almost invisible if you didn't want to see them. And for a long time, I didn't. I clung to the memory of the laughter, the affection, the closeness we had shared, telling myself that every couple had rough patches. But looking back, I see how those subtle shifts were the first indicators of the storm that was coming. It began with Andrea's tone. There was a sharpness to her words that hadn't been there before, a way of speaking to me that sounded less like love and more like criticism. If I forgot to pick up something from the grocery store, she wouldn't just remind me. She'd sigh dramatically and mutter, "You can't handle the simplest things, can you?" If I suggested a restaurant for dinner, she would roll her eyes and say, "You always choose boring places." They weren't screaming arguments, but each comment left a small sting. I brushed it off at first, telling myself she was stressed from work, that I shouldn't take it personally. But little by little, the warmth in her voice was replaced by impatience, and I began to feel like I was failing tests I hadn't even known I was taking. Another sign came in how she began to withdraw from the routines we once shared. Our Sunday cooking nights became rare because Andrea often claimed she was too tired or had other plans. When I suggested we stay in and watch a movie together, she would often dismiss it with, "I'm not in the mood for that kind of night." She started spending more evenings out with her colleagues or friends, coming home later and later, sometimes after midnight. When I asked her about it, she brushed me off, saying, "Don't be controlling, Daniel. I'm just enjoying life." It wasn't that I wanted to restrict her. I only wanted to spend time together. But somehow, expressing that desire made me feel guilty, as though I was being unreasonable for wanting what we once had. Her relationship with money also started to shift in ways that made me uneasy. At first, I didn't mind covering the bills or being the one to manage our finances. But soon, Andrea began making bigger purchases without discussing them with me. She'd come home with new gadgets, expensive clothes, or plan impromptu trips, assuming I'd just figure out how to make it work financially. When I tried to bring up budgeting, she would scoff and say, "Don't act like you're my father. I don't owe you an explanation for how I spend." That sentence always sat wrong with me. Not because I wanted control over her spending, but because I thought marriage meant partnership, meant making decisions together. Her words left me with the quiet realization that she didn't see it the same way. There were also the subtle shifts in affection. The tender gestures I had once taken for granted, the random texts, the hand-holding, the whispered reassurances, became less frequent. Instead, Andrea seemed distracted when we were together, scrolling on her phone during dinner, responding with half-hearted nods when I tried to share about my day. When I leaned in for intimacy, she sometimes pulled away, saying she wasn't in the mood. Again, I made excuses for her. Long hours at work, stress, exhaustion. But deep down, I felt the growing distance. It wasn't about physical closeness alone. It was the absence of the small affirmations that once reminded me I mattered. One of the clearest warning signs came during a family gathering. I invited Andrea to join me at my parents' house for my mother's birthday. She reluctantly agreed, but when we arrived, she stayed glued to her phone for most of the evening, barely engaging with anyone. When my sister asked her a friendly question, Andrea responded curtly, as though being there was a burden. On the way home, I tried to tell her how much it meant to me for her to connect with my family. She turned to me with irritation and said, "Daniel, I don't owe your family my time. Stop forcing me into things I don't care about." That sentence was a precursor to the harsher words she would eventually throw at me, but at the time I swallowed it down, convincing myself it was just a bad day. What unsettled me most was the way Andrea began framing my efforts as obligations rather than choices. If I did something thoughtful like surprising her with dinner after a long day, she didn't thank me anymore. She just accepted it as expected. If I helped her with a project, she wouldn't acknowledge the effort. I was simply doing what I was supposed to do. Once, when I gently reminded her about a small favor I had asked, she looked at me and said, "Why are you keeping score? You're my husband, aren't you? That's your role." Her words stung because they stripped away the love I thought was behind my actions, reducing them to duties on a checklist. These first warning signs didn't explode into my awareness all at once. They crept in slowly like shadows at dusk, covering the light piece by piece until I realized I was standing in the dark. At the time, I held on to the memory of the good times, telling myself we'd get back to them if I just tried harder, gave more, and stayed patient. But what I didn't understand was that the version of Andrea I had fallen in love with was slipping away. And in her place was someone who didn't see me as a partner but as a provider. Someone who believed love was one-sided, where she owed nothing and I owed everything. The tension that had once been subtle and ignorable became sharper, harder to dismiss and impossible to brush aside. The small criticisms that Andrea used to sprinkle into conversations evolved into outright contempt. It was no longer a matter of an eye roll or a sigh when I forgot something. It became biting words, accusations, and confrontations that drained me in ways I hadn't thought possible. The woman I had once shared laughter with now seemed to look at me as though I were a burden she had been forced to carry. And no matter how much I gave, it never seemed to be enough. The arguments started small but grew in intensity. One evening, I returned home after working late, arms full of groceries I had picked up so she wouldn't have to stop by the store. Instead of appreciating the gesture, Andrea looked at me with annoyance and asked why I had bought the wrong kind of rice. I tried to explain that the brand she liked had been out of stock, but before I could finish, she snapped, "Why is it so hard for you to get anything right? Do you ever listen?" The groceries I had carried with aching arms suddenly felt meaningless, and my effort turned to dust with a single sentence. Another night, the subject was money. Andrea had booked a spontaneous weekend trip with her friends without telling me. When I pointed out that our budget couldn't comfortably handle it, she leaned across the table, eyes blazing, and hissed, "You're not my accountant, Daniel. Stop trying to control me. I don't owe you an explanation for how I live my life." Her words landed like knives. It wasn't just about money. It was about the dismissal of partnership. In her eyes, my role wasn't to collaborate, but to provide unquestioningly. Any attempt I made to discuss shared responsibilities was met with hostility. as though I were some oppressive force in her life rather than her husband. Our social interactions began to expose the cracks even more visibly. At a friend's dinner party, Andrea made a cruel joke at my expense, mocking how much time I spent at work and implying that I wasn't ambitious enough compared to her colleagues. Laughter rippled around the table, but I sat there in silence, feeling my dignity erode. When I gently brought it up later, she shrugged and said, "Oh, don't be so sensitive. It was just a joke." But it didn't feel like a joke. It felt like a message, a public declaration that I wasn't enough, that I was falling short in ways she wanted others to see. The walls of our home, once a sanctuary, became filled with tension. Mornings started with complaints instead of good mornings. Nights ended with cold silence instead of goodnight kisses. If I attempted to bridge the distance, Andrea would accuse me of being clingy or needy. If I tried to give her space, she would accuse me of neglect. It was a no-win situation, one where I felt trapped in a cycle of doing everything wrong no matter how hard I tried. One of the most painful escalations came when I got sick. I had caught a heavy flu, and for a few days I was bedridden, weak, and feverish. In the past, Andrea might have brought me soup or checked in with concern. This time she hardly acknowledged my condition. When I asked if she could help pick up my prescription from the pharmacy, she looked at me and said flatly, "You're a grown man. Handle it yourself. I'm not your nurse." I lay there that night, aching and shivering, realizing that the nurturing partner I thought I had married no longer existed in the version of her that stood before me. It wasn't just her actions. It was the growing sense of entitlement she carried. Andrea began to speak openly about how much she deserved more from life, often comparing herself to friends who had wealthier husbands or more glamorous lifestyles. She would sigh dramatically, saying, "If only I had married someone more ambitious, things would be easier." She didn't seem to realize, or perhaps she didn't care, that her words stabbed at me with precision, carving deep insecurities into my chest. I began to question my worth, my abilities, and whether I was the problem. Was I truly not enough? The fights grew longer and more toxic. One evening, after a heated argument about her late-night outings, she screamed, "You're suffocating me. I don't owe you explanations, Daniel. Stop acting like you own me." That phrase, "I don't owe you anything," would eventually define the end of our marriage, but hearing it then made me realize how much her perspective had shifted. What I considered communication, she considered control. What I thought of as partnership, she dismissed as obligation. It was as though we were speaking two entirely different languages, and every attempt I made to translate only pushed her further away. I tried, desperately, to hold on. I read books on communication, reached out to her with long messages explaining my feelings, and even suggested counseling. Each effort was met with disdain. "Therapy is for weak couples," she said coldly. "If you need therapy to keep this marriage alive, maybe it's already dead." Her words crushed me because they were said with such certainty, as though she had already made peace with the idea of leaving me behind. The escalation didn't just erode my happiness, it began to wear on my identity. I no longer recognized myself in the mirror. The confident, hopeful man who had once fallen in love was now tired, anxious, and constantly second-guessing every word and action. I walked on eggshells in my own home, fearing that the slightest misstep would trigger another explosion. Love had been replaced by fear, and commitment by resentment. Looking back, I see that these escalating problems weren't random storms. They were signs of a deeper truth. Andrea no longer saw marriage as a shared journey. She saw it as a stage where she was owed devotion, resources, and attention, while she contributed as little as possible in return. And though I didn't realize it then, the cracks that had widened into gaping chasms were leading us to an inevitable collapse. By the time things between Andrea and me had reached their breaking point, I was no longer sure if my reality was clear or warped. I often lay awake at night wondering if I had somehow become the unreasonable one, if I was overreacting to her sharp words and dismissive behavior, if perhaps I had misunderstood what marriage was meant to be. The constant tension had eroded my confidence so deeply that I questioned not just my actions but my sanity. That's when the outside voices began to matter more than I could have imagined. It started with my younger sister, Carla. She had always been perceptive. The kind of person who could sense when something was wrong even before I opened my mouth. One Sunday afternoon, she dropped by unannounced to bring me some food she had cooked. Andrea was out with friends, so it was just the two of us sitting at the kitchen table. Carla looked around the apartment, then at me, and said softly, "You look exhausted, Kuya. What's going on?" I tried to brush it off, but my silence said more than I intended. Finally, she leaned in and asked the question that hit me harder than I expected. "Does she treat you the way you deserve to be treated?" I didn't answer right away. My instinct was to defend Andrea, to say that marriage was complicated and that every couple had problems. But the truth weighed heavily on me, and the words slipped out before I could stop them. "She doesn't see me anymore, Carla. It's like I don't matter unless I'm giving her something." My sister's eyes softened, and she reached across the table to squeeze my hand. "That's not love," she said quietly. "That's using you. You deserve better than this." Her words were like a mirror reflecting back the reality I had been trying to ignore. Not long after, a close friend from work, Marco, pulled me aside during a late shift. He had seen Andrea at a company gathering a few weeks earlier, and the way she had spoken to me hadn't escaped his notice. "Daniel," he said, "I don't mean to meddle, but the way she talks to you, man, it's not right. It's not just playful teasing, it's disrespect." I tried to laugh it off, but Marco didn't let me. "Look, I've known you for years. You're one of the most dependable people I know. But dependable doesn't mean you should be a doormat. You're carrying this whole relationship on your back, and she's not lifting a finger. That's not fair to you." Hearing it from Marco, who had no stake in my marriage and no reason to sugarcoat things, hit differently. It wasn't just in my head. Others saw it too. They saw the imbalance, the cruelty hidden behind Andrea's charm, the way she took without giving. And instead of accusing me of overreacting, they confirmed what I had been too afraid to admit. I was being mistreated. The most surprising validation came from my parents. For a long time, I had kept the details of our marriage away from them. I didn't want them to worry, and I didn't want to feel like I had failed in their eyes. But they had noticed Andrea's behavior in small ways during family gatherings. One evening, after Andrea had skipped yet another dinner with them, my father pulled me aside. He was a man of few words, but the ones he chose stayed with me. "Son," he said, "love is not supposed to look like this. I see the way you've changed. You're quieter now, like the light's been dimmed in you. If someone loves you, they don't take that light away. They help it shine brighter." I felt a lump in my throat. My father wasn't a man who spoke about feelings often, so for him to notice my dimmed spirit meant the truth was visible, even to those I had tried to shield. My mother, too, expressed concern. She reminded me of my childhood resilience, how I had always been strong-willed and independent. "Where is that boy now?" she asked gently. "Because all I see is a man who has forgotten how to stand up for himself." These external voices started to pierce the fog of self-doubt Andrea had wrapped around me. Every time she belittled me, I had convinced myself that maybe she was right, that maybe I wasn't doing enough, that maybe I was falling short. But now, hearing people I trusted and respected confirm what I had been experiencing, I began to realize that the problem wasn't just me. The cracks in our marriage weren't illusions created by my sensitivity. They were real, visible to anyone who cared to look. Even casual acquaintances noticed. One of Andrea's old college friends, someone I barely knew, ran into me at a cafe one afternoon. She hesitated before speaking, then said, "I hope you don't mind me saying this, but Andrea, she's changed a lot. She used to be more grounded. Now, the way she talks about your marriage, it worries me. Please take care of yourself." It startled me to hear this from someone so far removed, but it only added to the mounting evidence. The validation from others didn't solve my problems overnight, but it did something crucial. It broke the isolation. For so long, Andrea had made me feel like I was alone in my experience, like my feelings were invalid or exaggerated. But now I understood that people saw the truth. I wasn't crazy, I wasn't weak, I wasn't failing. I was being drained by a relationship that no longer honored me. With each conversation, a seed was planted in me. A seed of courage, of clarity, of the possibility of another life. And though I wasn't ready to make a decision yet, I felt the ground shifting beneath me. For the first time in years, I wasn't just surviving Andrea's storms. I was beginning to imagine what it might look like to step out of them altogether. There comes a point when even the strongest rope frays beyond repair, when no amount of tying or twisting can bring it back together. For me, that moment arrived one humid evening in August, when the heat inside our apartment seemed to match the tension that had been boiling between Andrea and me for months. I had just finished a long day at work, exhausted and carrying the familiar dread of walking through the front door. I never knew what mood would greet me: indifference, irritation, or outright hostility. But I knew peace was no longer an option. That night, it was hostility. Andrea was already pacing the living room, phone in hand, her voice raised as she spoke to a friend on speakerphone. She was complaining about me, her own husband, as though I were some trivial inconvenience in her life. "He's so boring," she said, not realizing I had walked in. "All he does is work and come home tired. Honestly, sometimes I feel like I'm wasting my best years with someone who doesn't even inspire me." The words hit me like a punch to the chest. I froze in the doorway, unable to move, my briefcase still dangling from my hand. When she finally noticed me standing there, she didn't flinch or apologize. Instead, she smirked and said, "Well, it's true. Maybe if you tried harder, I wouldn't have to vent about you." In that moment, something inside me broke. It wasn't anger that washed over me. It was clarity. For years, I had convinced myself that if I just loved her harder, sacrificed more, bent further, she would one day appreciate me. But hearing her speak so casually about wasting her life with me stripped away the last of my illusions. I realized then that nothing I did would ever be enough, because Andrea didn't want partnership. She wanted a pedestal, and I was the fool who kept climbing onto it, believing it was love. The days that followed only deepened my descent into rock bottom. Andrea grew bolder in her contempt, staying out late without explanation, making plans without consulting me, and treating our shared home as though it were merely a stopover between her social events. When I tried to have a conversation about it, she cut me off with that same cold refrain: "I don't owe you anything." Those words, once shocking, now felt like a weapon she wielded freely, each repetition hammering home the truth that she no longer saw herself as part of us, only as an individual who happened to occupy the same space as me. One night, after another argument that ended with her storming out, I sat alone at the kitchen table with a glass of water, staring at the silence she left behind. The apartment felt hollow, and so did I. I thought back to the man I used to be, the one with dreams, energy, and hope. I barely recognized him anymore. I had become a shell, drained of joy, consumed by anxiety, and paralyzed by the fear of letting go. That was when the weight of it all finally crashed onto me. I wasn't just unhappy, I was disappearing. Piece by piece, Andrea was erasing me, and I was letting her do it. The realization hit harder when I looked in the mirror the next morning. My eyes were bloodshot, the dark circles beneath them deep and heavy. My shoulders slumped, my jaw was tight, and I looked older than my years. This wasn't just emotional damage, it was physical. The stress had taken root in my body, eating away at my health, my sleep, and my peace of mind. That morning, I whispered to myself, "This can't be love. Not anymore." The final straw came a week later at a family gathering I had begged Andrea to attend. My parents had been looking forward to seeing us together, but Andrea sat at the table scrolling on her phone, barely engaging, responding with curt answers when anyone tried to speak to her. At one point, my mother asked her a simple question about her work, and Andrea sighed loudly before saying, "Why do I always have to explain myself? I don't owe anyone here anything." The room fell silent. My parents exchanged a pained glance, and I felt the heat of embarrassment rise in my chest. That was when it struck me with brutal finality. She wasn't just dismissing me anymore. She was dismissing everyone, including the people who had loved and supported me long before she ever came into my life. Driving home that night, Andrea criticized my family, calling them nosy and draining. I didn't argue back. I simply gripped the steering wheel and let the words wash over me like acid. But deep down, I knew I couldn't do it anymore. The woman beside me was not my partner, not my ally, not the person I had once believed would walk through life with me. She was someone who took everything and gave nothing, someone who thrived on reminding me of my inadequacies, someone who had hollowed me out until there was barely anything left. Heibel, that was rock bottom. It wasn't a dramatic explosion or a single catastrophic event. It was the accumulation of every cut, every dismissal, every word that told me I was not enough. It was the moment I understood that staying meant losing myself completely, while leaving meant at least having a chance to rebuild. For the first time, I saw the truth with no filters, no excuses, no denial. Andrea was never going to change, and if I wanted to survive, I had to. As I lay in bed that night, Andrea asleep beside me, I stared at the ceiling and made a silent vow. I would not let her erase me. I would not spend the rest of my life paying debts she invented, debts she claimed I owed simply for existing. She said she didn't owe me anything, and finally, I believed her. But I also realized I didn't owe her everything. And that clarity, as painful as it was, marked the beginning of the end. The night I realized Andrea would never change, I knew my silence could no longer protect me. For years, I had allowed her voice to be louder than my own, her demands to outweigh my needs, her dismissals to shape my reality. But the moment I accepted that she did not owe me anything, I also embraced the truth that I didn't owe her my life. That clarity didn't come with fireworks or anger. It came with a quiet steadiness, a calm I hadn't felt in years. The decision was no longer a question. I had to leave. In the days that followed, I began to plan, carefully and deliberately. I didn't announce my intentions to Andrea, because I knew she would twist my words, turn them against me, or guilt me into staying. Instead, I opened a separate bank account, transferring a small portion of my salary each month without her noticing. I quietly began gathering documents, my birth certificate, work contracts, savings records, and placing them in a folder I kept in my office drawer. I started reaching out to old contacts, lining up potential living arrangements in case I needed to move quickly. Every step I took felt like reclaiming a piece of myself, like drawing boundaries where there had once only been surrender. The breaking point came one evening when Andrea returned home late, clearly intoxicated, and began berating me for not having dinner ready for her. She stumbled into the kitchen, knocking over a glass, and shouted, "What kind of husband are you? You can't even do the simplest things right." Something inside me refused to flinch. I looked at her, not with fear or guilt, but with a calm detachment. "I'm the kind of husband who's finally done," I said quietly. She froze, blinking in disbelief, then laughed as though it were a joke. But when I calmly walked into the bedroom, grabbed the small suitcase I had packed days earlier, and headed toward the door, her laughter turned into panic. "Wait, what do you mean? Where are you going?" For the first time, I didn't answer her. I simply left. I stayed with my friend Marco for the first few nights, grateful for the refuge. He didn't ask for details, didn't press me to explain. He just gave me space, food, and quiet. In that silence, I felt the weight of years begin to lift. The first morning I woke up without Andrea's voice hovering over me, I realized how suffocating the marriage had truly been. The air felt different, lighter. I could breathe without fear of being criticized for the way I breathed. It was a small freedom, but it felt monumental. The weeks that followed weren't easy. Andrea bombarded me with messages, swinging between rage and pleading. She accused me of being a coward, of abandoning my vows, of ruining her life. Then, in the next breath, she begged me to come home, promising things would be different. But her words no longer had power over me. I had spent years chasing promises that dissolved into smoke, and I wasn't going to do it again. I blocked her number after the third week, not out of anger, but out of necessity. I needed distance to heal, to rediscover myself. Slowly, I began rebuilding. I threw myself into work with renewed focus, not as an escape, but as a way of regaining confidence in my abilities. I reconnected with family, visiting my parents more often, sharing meals where laughter returned to the table. My sister Carla reminded me that life didn't end when a marriage ended. Sometimes, that was when it truly began. I took up running again, something I had abandoned because Andrea used to mock me for being too obsessive about it. With every mile I ran, I shed another layer of the resentment and exhaustion that had weighed me down. The biggest change was internal. I no longer carried the constant dread of being inadequate. I began to see myself not as the man who failed to hold a marriage together, but as the man who had the courage to walk away from a cage. There were nights when loneliness crept in, when I questioned whether I had done the right thing, but then I remembered Andrea's voice, cold and dismissive. "I don't owe you anything," and I would remind myself of the vow I had made, to stop owing her everything. Months later, standing on a quiet beach during a short solo trip, I reflected on everything I had endured. The waves rolled in and out, steady and unstoppable, reminding me that life too had a rhythm of loss and renewal. I realized that the greatest mistake I had made was believing that love meant losing myself for someone else. Love is not about debt or obligation. It's about choice, reciprocity, and respect. Without those, it's not love. It's control disguised as commitment. Now, when people ask me what happened to my marriage, I don't speak with bitterness. I simply say I learned that love isn't about owing, it's about sharing. And once I understood that, I knew I had to walk away. The wisdom I carry is simple but hard-earned. Never confuse sacrifice with surrender, never confuse compromise with erasure, and never let someone convince you that you owe them your life just for being there. Andrea was right about one thing. She didn't owe me anything, but she was wrong to think that meant I had to keep paying a price that never ended. By walking away, I stopped the transaction and started living again. And in that decision, I found not just freedom, but a chance to rebuild my life on my own terms. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.